Few weeks ago, I guess it'd be over a month ago now, I made a video regarding young offenders in the UK. I'll be totally honest, there are a few issues in this country that depress me as much as this subject. Um, of course, young people aren't the only people who commit crime, but the difference is adult offenders, at least, there's an expectation of tougher sentencing. I am convinced, and I've long been convinced, that the overt leniency that our justice system shows to young offenders only serves to enable them. It enables them, it insults their victims, and it's actually endangers the public. Um, and I find myself immensely frustrated with the powers that be, that is, the respective sentencing councils in England and Wales and in Scotland. In Scotland, they have a particularly absurd position, which is that people under the age of 25, not under 18, under 25, will effectively be treated as minors. And they cite research that supposedly talks about brain development not being fully reached before that age. I mean, you can get married, you can drive, you can drink, you can vote, you can join the armed forces, you can start your own business. But if you commit a crime in Scotland and you're 24, you're not going to be treated the same way as a 26-year-old. That's effectively what that means. I think it's an absolute disgrace, and I've told them as much. I have had communication with them, and I've challenged them on this point. They just doubled down on it and gave typically bureaucratic language. I was not impressed by the response, but you just have to look at any number of cases that we've seen in this country. A few years ago, I believe it was in Sheffield, or it was a northern city anyway. I can't remember off the top of my head where it was, but there was a gang of teenagers and they assaulted an older man. I think the guy was in his 70s outside a shopping centre, and the guy that threw the punch got 2.5 years. The man died. That is the sort of sentencing that is absolutely tone deaf to public opinion, disgraceful. And of course, legal people will say, oh, but judges look at aggravating and mitigating circumstances. They look at all sorts of things. They look at the age of the offender. I do think that previous offences are not taken into account anywhere near as much as they should be. Generally speaking, also with adult offenders, when you get habitual criminals, people who are committing offence after offence after offence, that should be aggravating the sentence, not ignored. I think too often it's ignored. Um, and I do think that maybe not all young offenders, but too many young offenders just don't fear justice. They have this attitude of they literally know themselves that their age protects them. So this culture of leniency actually enables them. It enables them because it teaches them that they're not going to face real consequences for what they've done. Um, and of course, no two cases are identical. And I'm not, by the way, saying that you never have a situation where a young offender doesn't get a stiff sentence. Occasionally that does happen. But more often than not, it just isn't proportionate to the gravity of the crime. How many times do we see a situation where you get someone standing up to teenage thugs and they end up paying a price? Either that is in the form of the teenage gang literally laying into them, hospitalizing them, or worse. Or they even run the risk of, because they've stood up for themselves. Supposedly self-defense is an old defense in English law, but if it's an adult going up against teenagers, I really think there's something fundamentally rotten about this passive approach that we take to young offenders. And, the powers that be, the justice establishment, they say, oh, but we treat them differently. There's still a chance of rehabilitation. If you have a 16-year-old who is a career criminal, who's constantly shoplifting, mouthing off at strangers, assaulting people for disrespecting him, um, the idea that a bit of community sentencing, the idea that cleaning someone's garden is going to get him to see the light, is absurd. It really is absurd. So I think sentencing needs to be a lot tougher in this area. But what I want to address in this video, because this is something I've spoken about many times, but what I want to address is those who, and it has to be said, they're predominantly on the liberal left, their attitude when they hear about my sort of rhetoric is, oh, but you're vilifying young people, you're stigmatizing young people. That's the point I particularly want to address, because it's not stigmatizing young people in general. It's talking about young offenders. Now, some of the main victims of young offenders are other young people. I remember when I was 16 years old, I was forced, along with my family, to move house because local jobs were tormenting us. So pushing for a hard line on young offenders is not being against young people. I strongly reject that notion. In fact, I would argue that young victims of crime deserve a much bigger voice. Young victims of crime need to be heard a lot more. Because you know what? If you find a young person who's been the victim of a mugging or attacked by a gang, they will be just as angry as any other victim of crime. They want justice just as much as anyone else. And what the liberal left need to remember is that young offenders don't represent all young people. So when they accuse people like me of stigmatizing young people, we're not talking about all young people, we're talking about young offenders. I mean, there's a lot of young people who do a lot of good. I remember a young guy who basically he drowned in the Thames, um, and he was posthumously awarded, I think, in the Pride of Britain Awards, which is a very good thing. I give the Daily Mirror credit for initiating that. He saved a woman's life, but sadly he drowned. There's many young people who get involved in charity efforts. You know, I remember one young guy. He was actually terminally ill. He was dying of cancer, but even in his final days, he was raising money for charity. There's many young people out there who can hold their heads high, who really, do help in society and really do they do selfless things. And it would be ridiculous vilifying young people because we've all been young. So I really reject this accusation that taking a hardline attitude to young offenders is somehow the same as vilifying young people. If anything, it's showing compassion towards young victims of crime by saying they deserve justice. So if you get a gang of teenagers who lay into another teenager because he or she is in the wrong place at the wrong time, don't they deserve justice? Don't they deserve something more than their perpetrators, their tormentors are given a tap on the wrist and given a community sentence? They deserve to see those people put in jail. And yes, I accept a 15-year-old shouldn't be sent to an adult jail, but a young offenders institute. I really think that the powers that be, the justice establishment, is living in a bubble. They do not understand the fear, the anxiety that is caused to the public by young offenders who are out of control. And this is often manifested at a relatively minor level. So, for example, the other day I was walking into my local shopping centre and two teenage girls came out and they had like a McDonald's bag or something. They just threw it on the ground. And I did. I spoke up. I said, look, there's a bin just there. No, first of all, I said, you've dropped something. They said, oh, yeah, we do it all the time. And I said, there's a bin just there. And they say, oh, if you're so bothered, you pick it up. Now, this is obviously very, very minor in the grand scheme of things, but it does point to a wider attitude issue you get with some young people. And that then manifests, well, if they think that's perfectly okay, what's to stop them, mouthing off at strangers generally, or, assaulting someone who disrespects them? To be clear, I have no fear of teenage girls, right? There's no threat there. If they were teenage boys, I would have said the same thing, but there's a higher risk factor because, people have this very naive idea that teenagers are harmless, extremely naive. I would frankly be a lot more scared of a group of teenagers than an adult man who may have a criminal record. I honestly, a group of teenagers scares me more. I can handle an adult man. And in fact, I have on occasion. There was a time I was on the Tyne Metro, and occasionally, we have to deal with drunks and so on. And there was a guy got on. He was about mid 40s. He was drunk. He was mouthing off, and I was wary. I was sort of looking at him and wary of his movements. But I thought, yeah, if it turns to it, I can handle this guy if I have to. If that was a group of teenagers, I'd be a lot more anxious. Because for one thing, even if you defend yourself, there's a legal aspect there. If I defend myself from a 45-year-old, a 35-year-old, he's an adult. He's another adult. That's self-defense. If it's teenagers, the law is an ass. The law will actually potentially hold me liable. It's disgusting. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I think one of the most important reasons why there needs to be tougher penalties for young offenders is to protect other young people who are being terrorized, who are frightened to leave their own homes, who are being bullied mercilessly by these thugs. I think leniency sends out the message that what you're doing isn't too bad, oh, you're young, so you could get away with it. It's absolutely wrong. And it absolutely shames our justice establishment. I don't think they understand public anger and anxiety on this issue. I think they're wrapped in their little bureaucrat bubble. I just don't think they get it. And it infuriates me. And frankly, it also scares me because in my area, in the year 2022, there were two cases. There was a man, 35-year-old man, was effectively beaten to death by a gang of teenagers in Northumberland because words were said and, he stood up to them. And there was another case in County Durham where a teenage boy was killed by a gang of other teenagers. And when I say gang, I mean 20 strong. That to me is utterly terrifying. That is far scarier than any horror film. Um, I think the ringleader got something like 12 years, but I just think overall there's just far too much leniency when it comes to young offenders. They're not scared of justice, and that is the problem. If they're not scared of justice, they're going to keep doing what they're doing. So we need a system that protects all victims of crime. That includes young victims of crime.